hotel had seen better nights. It had seen worse ones too, but tonight carried a different weight, the kind that settled in your chest before anything even happened, like the air itself had read the schedule and decided to clock out early. Charlie Morningstar stood on the roof of the Hazbin Hotel and watched the clouds above Pentagram City fold in on themselves. Not the normal sulphurous churn of hell's perpetual overcast. Something else. Something that pushed against the red-tinged atmosphere like a thumb pressing through wet paper. She had prepared for this. They all had. Vaggie had drilled evacuation routes into every resident until even Husk could recite them backward, and he'd been 3 drinks deep for most of the sessions. Nifty had scrubbed every inch of the lobby twice, as though clean floors might somehow matter when angels came to kill you. Alastor had said nothing useful, and smiled through all of it, which was somehow more unsettling than if, he'd argued. Charlie gripped the edge of the parapet and told herself the tightness behind her sternum was adrenaline, not dread. She was very good at telling herself things. Then the sky opened. It happened the way it always did on Extermination Day. And yet it never stopped feeling like the first time a seam of white light splitting the heavens from one horizon to the other. The tearing sound arriving a half-second late like distant thunder. And then the portal, massive, perfect, burning, with the clean, cold radiance of something that had never once doubted itself. It hung directly above the hotel's rooftop garden. Not above the city. Above the hotel. Above the spot Charlie had planted a small row of flowers 3 weeks ago, because she thought the residents might like something living to look at. Heaven wasn't sweeping the city tonight. It was making a statement. The opening had been positioned deliberately surgically above the one building in Pentagram City that had the audacity to suggest things could be different. Charlie had approximately 4 seconds to process that before the first wave of white-armored soldiers poured through. They moved with the absolute economy of motion that came from doing the same job the same night every year, without exception. Golden halos. Wings folded back for dive speed. Celestial steel catching the light of the opening above, as the column descended in tight formation, and at its head loud enough to be heard over the wind of descent came the voice of Adam. "Honey, I'm home." Charlie dropped back through the roof access door. She hit the top landing of the stairwell at the same moment Vaggie came up, with 2 spears already in hand, her single eye sharp, and reading the situation faster than Charlie could explain it. "They're right above us," Charlie said. "I know. I heard him. Everyone's in position." Vaggie's jaw was set in that particular way that meant she was afraid and had already decided not to waste time on it. "Stay close." Charlie conjured her shield, the apple and serpent motif, flickering into place along her forearm, and followed Vaggie back down. The lobby of the Hazbin Hotel had been many things over its short operational history: a disaster, a miracle, a work in progress, a punchline. Tonight it was a choke point. Husk was behind the bar, which was the safest place for him, not because it offered cover, but because he refused to be more than arm's reach from the good bottles. Nifty moved along the baseboards at a speed that suggested she had absorbed the concept of danger and filed it under exciting. Alastor stood near the center of the room, one hand on his staff smile in place, and said nothing at all. The front windows shattered inward at the same moment the east wall took its first hit. Outside, the street had become a different kind of geometry. The strike team on the ground level was already working methodical, efficient, moving through pockets of souls who hadn't made it inside in time. The celestial weapons did what they were designed to do. Demons didn't just fall. They stopped. Permanently. The kind of stop that didn't allow for hell's usual recycling, the resurrection, and the reassignment. One touch, and whatever made a soul simply came undone. Vaggie was in the doorway before Charlie could stop her. throwing a dagger that caught one of the soldiers across the wrist and knocked an angelic short sword wide. The soul it would have hit scrambled backward into the lobby and collapsed against the reception desk, shaking. "Get to the back hall," Vaggie told it, voice flat. "Now." It went. This was how the next 90 seconds worked. Controlled chaos, the hotel's small crew holding a perimeter that kept shrinking as more white armor touched down in the street. Charlie deflected 2 direct strikes with her shield. Husk reached into his coat and flicked a card the way a magician flicks a trick. Except this one exploded, detonating against a pauldron and buying them 6 feet of breathing room. Nifty was doing something at speed near the east wall that Charlie couldn't fully track and decided not to examine too closely. Alastor had moved to the stairs without seeming to walk there and was watching the street through the empty window frame with the expression of a man waiting for a chess opponent to finish a move he'd already anticipated. Above all of it, up through the ruined glass ceiling of the upper atrium, the heavenly rift pulsed. White, cold, relentless. Through it, the reinforcements kept arriving in unbroken line that had no interest in stopping. That was when the rift did something it was not supposed to do. The edges flickered. Not the way a portal flickered when it was opening or closing. This was different. A stutter. An interruption. The clean white seam developed a second tier, running perpendicular to it, this one, the particular blue-green of deep water or old electricity. And for 3 seconds, the 2 wounds in reality coexisted in a way that made the air between them crackle with something entirely foreign to Hell's atmosphere. It felt wrong in a specific way, not the wrongness of danger, but the wrongness of a frequency bleeding through from a channel that had no business broadcasting here. Charlie noticed it because she was looking up. Vaggie noticed it because she noticed everything. Adam, somewhere in the sky above, probably did not notice it because he was busy being Adam. The second tier widened. Just enough. Something fell through, not an angel. The silhouette was wrong, no white, no gold, no wings folding back for a controlled descent. What came through the gap was a teenager in jeans and a white t-shirt with red trim, dropping at the speed of someone who had not planned to be falling, which was to say very fast and with no elegance whatsoever. He caught himself about 12 feet off the ground, which meant whatever he was, he could fly or had figured out that he needed to start very quickly. He hovered there for a moment in the smoke and the debris and the ambient noise of an active extermination and looked around with the wide-eyed, rapidly calculating expression of someone running triage on a situation they had zero context for. Dark hair. Blue eyes, not the sharp, ageless blue of something supernatural. Just the ordinary blue of a kid who hadn't finished growing yet. He was young in the way that registered before anything else, the kind of young that made the surroundings look even worse by contrast. One of the armored soldiers 20 feet to his left hadn't noticed him yet. It was bringing its weapon down toward a soul, pinned against a crumbled wall section, the kind of strike that would be the last thing that soul ever experienced. The teenager's eyes tracked to it, calculated, decided. He moved. Not toward safety, toward the strike. He went intangible a half-second before the celestial edge would have caught his shoulder. Charlie saw his body lose its solid definition, the outline blurring like a photograph taken in motion. The physical world simply declining to register him, and he came out of it with one hand already wrapped around the soldier's weapon arm at the wrist. The grip didn't look like much. The result was that the swing went wide by exactly enough, and the armored figure stumbled into a rotation it hadn't planned for. The pinned soul hit the ground, scrambled, got up, ran. The teenager released the wrist and put 6 feet between them in under a second back, in the air watching, assessing. The soldier rounded on him with the weapon raised, and he held both hands out empty and said the first thing he said in hell. "Hey, I'm not with them." He glanced at the soul disappearing around a corner, then back at the armored figure, and his voice carried the tone of someone making a reasonable point in an unreasonable setting. And I'm not with the ones running away either. Can we not do the stabbing thing? That'd be great. The soldier did not want to not do the stabbing thing. What happened next was quick enough that Charlie, watching from the doorway, had to reconstruct it after the fact. The celestial steel came forward. The teenager dropped 6 inches straight down, letting it pass over him, and when he came back up, he was behind the soldier, and the hand that had grabbed the wrist before now pressed flat against the weapon hand, with enough controlled force to loosen the grip. The short sword hit the street. The teenager kicked it not hard, just directionally, and it slid 15 feet away from both of them. The soldier turned. He was already gone back in the air, putting altitude between himself and the situation with the ease of someone who had run this particular calculation many times before. He looked down at the weapon on the ground, then at the chaos unrolling in every direction, then up at the heavenly rift, still cycling soldiers through at a steady and deeply problematic rate. Charlie stepped out of the doorway. "Hey," she called up. "Up there." He looked down at her. She registered the same thing she'd registered from 50 feet away, how young he was, and how fast he was reading her, cataloging whether she was a threat, an ally, or a variable he hadn't accounted for yet. "Are you with the hotel?" she asked. A pause. He looked at the building behind her, at the sign cracked now, one letter dark, but still readable. At her. At the street. "I don't know what that means," he said, "but I'm guessing the people trying to kill everyone aren't the ones staying at it." "Good guess." Charlie kept her shield up but lowered her angle. "What's your name?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "Danny." Above them, the rift pulsed again. The descending column hadn't broken. Across the street, someone screamed, not in pain and warning, and a section of wall came down in a cascade of red brick and sulfur-singed mortar. Danny looked at the falling debris, then at the 2 souls trapped underneath its trajectory. Then he was already moving, and Charlie was running after him, and Vaggie was 2 steps behind her, saying something in a tone that could charitably be described as extremely concerned. The wall came down. Danny caught it. Not with his hands, with a telekinetic grip that visibly cost him nothing, the rubble freezing mid-fall and hanging there with all the casual authority of someone pausing a video. He held it for 3 seconds, exactly long enough for both souls to drag themselves clear, then let the wreckage drop into empty space. He landed next to them, checked them over with a fast, practiced look. The look of someone who had assessed field injuries before more than once and said, "Can you walk?" One said yes. The other was less sure. Danny got an arm under the second one's shoulder without being asked and started toward the hotel entrance. Charlie stared. Vaggie appeared at her shoulder. "Don't," Vaggie said quietly. "I wasn't going to say anything. You had the face. I don't have a face. You have a face, Charlie." Inside the lobby, Husk watched Danny come through the door with a wounded soul under one arm and the look of someone already calculating where the next problem was coming from. Husk reached under the bar, produced a glass, and set it on the counter. "Kid," he said. And then he actually stopped and looked at Danny for a full second and said it again with different emphasis. "Kid, like an actual kid." Danny set the soul down on the nearest intact piece of furniture, looked at the shattered windows, the cracked walls, the distant sound of celestial steel working through the street outside. "How old are you?" Charlie asked, because she needed to know, and now was as reasonable a time as any. Danny glanced at her. Something in his expression suggested this was not the first time the question had come up at an inconvenient moment. 14, he said. A brief silence occupied the lobby alongside all the other things currently occupying it. Yeah, said Husk, reaching for a bottle he wasn't going to share. This is the worst possible day to be a walk-in. The lobby had a system now. It wasn't a good system, but it was functioning, which in hell counted as a miracle. Vaggie had split the ground floor into 3 zones, in the time it took Charlie to cross the room, the front line, at the broken windows, the secondary hold at the stairwell base, and the back corridor where the wounded went if they could still move under their own power. She'd communicated this entirely in clipped sentences and hand signals, and the hotel's residents had responded the way people respond when someone speaks with enough certainty they moved. Danny had watched from the doorway for about 4 seconds before Vaggie turned and pointed at him. You. Can you pull things from a distance? Yeah. Disarm, don't destroy. We need those weapons off the field, not scattered where anyone can grab them. She was already turning back to the window. Stay mobile, don't get cornered. It was the most tactically sound briefing Danny had ever received from someone who'd known him for under 3 minutes. He filed that away and went back out. The street outside the Hazbin hotel had stopped being a street in any meaningful sense. It was a combat zone with a street underneath it, somewhere buried under debris, and the constant pressure of white armor pushing inward from 3 directions. The ranks moved in pairs, now covering each other's flanks. A shift that had happened in the time Danny spent inside, which meant they were reading the situation and adjusting. Fine. So was he. He went invisible before his boots cleared the doorframe. The thing about invisibility in a loud environment was that it handed you about 6 seconds of genuine surprise before the enemy started tracking by sound and air displacement instead of sight. Danny had learned this the hard way across 2 years of ghost zone altercations and built a working theory from it. 6 seconds was enough if you used them right. He used them right. The nearest pair had a sinner's souls demons, whatever they called themselves down here, pinned against the remains of a street lamp. Down on one knee, one arm up in a futile block, watching the closer figure's weapon come back for a finishing strike. Danny materialized 2 feet behind the left flank, reached through intangibility to close his fingers around the weapon wrist, and applied exactly enough pressure in exactly the wrong direction for a grip to hold. The celestial short sword dropped. He was gone again before the armored figure completed its turn. The sinner on the ground stared at the empty space where a hand had briefly existed. Danny's voice came from approximately nowhere. Door. Now. Don't stop. They went. He lifted the dropped weapon with telekinesis from 8 feet up and sent it spinning onto the hotel roof, out of reach of anyone without wings, and if they flew up for it, they'd stop covering the ground. The second figure in the pair was scanning for him, head moving in sharp arcs. Danny drifted left, gave it nothing to track, moved on. This was the rhythm he settled into over the next 2 minutes. Disappear to close distance phase through the strikes that came close reach out with telekinesis to strip celestial steel from hands, or redirect swings mid-arc. He didn't throw a single punch. Didn't need to. The arithmetic was simpler. A soldier without a weapon couldn't end someone permanently, and permanently was the only variable that actually mattered here. The weapons themselves were the wrinkle he kept running into. They registered wrong on a level below conscious thought, a frequency his ghost half recognized as a hard stop. The one time a soldier's edge swung close enough to clip his sleeve. He felt it. Before contact, a cold that wasn't temperature, a signal that said this is final, and he was intangible before it landed. That was the distinction no one in Amity Park had ever managed to build into anything. Every ghost he'd faced, every piece of Fenton tech, every trap Walker had ever set, they could hurt him, drain him, slow him down. This was a different category entirely. Getting tagged by one of those weapons at full contact wasn't a setback. It was the end of the sentence. So he didn't get tagged. And he made sure other people didn't either. By the 90-second mark, he'd thinned the perimeter around the hotel entrance, enough that sinners could move without a weapon tracking them at every step. 8 short swords were on the roof. 3 more were down a storm drain. 2 disarmed figures had retreated to the edge of the block, apparently reconsidering their immediate purpose, which was the most Danny could reasonably ask. He landed on a section of intact wall above the entrance arch and did a fast count. It wasn't enough. The column descending through the heavenly rift had not slowed. If anything, the pace had tightened, reinforcements dropping lower in tighter clusters, compensating for the gaps he'd been punching in their coverage. For every piece of celestial steel he'd cleared, a fresh arrival had brought another one. The numbers didn't work in his favor, and Danny had always been quick at numbers. From above and to the right, a voice cut through the noise, with the lazy confidence of someone who had never once questioned his own volume. "I don't know what that thing is, boys, but let's not let it keep ruining the fun." Danny didn't look up. He'd clocked at him earlier, hard to miss, given the wingspan and the way the white column repositioned whenever he banked overhead, and he'd made the deliberate choice to stay out of that orbit. The General's reach would be a different caliber of problem. The General himself would be a different caliber of problem. First rule of every fight Danny had ever been in: don't open 2 fronts you can't close. He dropped back to street level as Vaggie appeared in the doorway. "Entrance is workable," he said, "but they're adjusting. Another minute before the pattern breaks again." Vaggie looked at the street, then at him, and it was a different kind of look than the first one, quicker, like something had just registered. "How are you doing this without a weapon?" "I'm not fighting them. I'm taking the fight away from them." A beat. "Different thing." She held his gaze. "You're a kid." "Not right now." Whatever she'd been about to add, she swallowed it. The battlefield didn't have space for it. "Don't get killed." "Working on it." He was back in the air before she finished turning. The next sequence was Messire. The white column had started grouping weapon carriers behind unarmed point men, putting a physical barrier between Danny's reach and the actual threat. Pulling celestial steel through a body created complications. He didn't want to navigate at speed. He shifted approach. Instead of targeting the weapons directly, he went for angles. A raised arm was a lever. Some pressure at the right joint in the right moment redirected a strike without requiring him to touch the edge at all. It worked, but it was slower. Slower meant more ground to cover. He hauled a sinner clear of a down swing by the collar and set them behind overturned masonry. Went phase through an armored figure that stepped into his flight path without breaking pace. Used a brief overshadow, 2 seconds, maybe 3 fingers, just barely threading into someone's motor control, because longer than that was a gamble. He wasn't willing to run, and made a weapon hand open at the exact moment the swing would have connected. The short sword hit the ground. He was out before the figure registered what had happened to its own arm. The sinner who would have died stood there just breathing. "Building," Danny said, already moving. "In. Go." From the hotel entrance, Husk's voice rolled out over the general noise. Rough aggrieved, the sound of someone who had not agreed to any of this and was making sure everyone knew it while doing it anyway. "Move, move, come on. I am not a doorman. I am categorically not your yes, fine. Through here, watch the glass. Don't bleed on anything I have to clean." Nifty shot past him in the opposite direction, one knife already out, apparently having identified something that required her personal attention. She was smiling. This was considerably more alarming than the knife. Danny didn't have time to process either of them, because the grouping at the far end of the block had just changed. The white column there had stopped moving, not retreating, not pressing forward. Pulling into a tight cluster, weapons raised to a uniform angle, looking up not at Danny, not at the hotel, but at the tear above. Waiting. as he watched more figures peeled away from scattered positions across the block and folded into the group, moving with the quiet coordination of a unit that had received a very specific instruction. He counted 11, 12, still growing. Charlie appeared in the doorway, shield up, watching the same convergence. "What are they doing?" she asked. Danny had seen enough coordinated pushes to recognize the shape assembling in front of him. The spacing, the raised angle, the way they'd stopped functioning as individuals and started functioning as a single directed force. "They're done picking off scattered targets," he said. "They're going to drive straight through the front door." A beat of quiet in the middle of everything that wasn't quiet. "All of them," he added, because the scale seemed worth clarifying. Charlie looked at the cluster, then at the entrance behind her, then at Danny with the expression of someone who had been sincerely hoping he was wrong about this. He wasn't wrong about this. The push started with sound. Not shouting, not war cries. The white column didn't bother with any of that. What came first was the rhythm boots hitting broken asphalt in unison, a low mechanical thump that traveled through the ground before it reached the air. Thump, thump, thump. 12 figures moving as one mass. The wedge formation tight and deliberate point men, at the front with nothing in their hands and weapon carriers slotted behind them like the teeth of something that hadn't opened its mouth yet. Danny watched it from the wall above the entrance arch and understood immediately what he was looking at. Not a charge, a press. The kind of advance designed not to break through quickly, but to make everything in front of it feel inevitable. He dropped into the street and put himself between the wedge and the door. "Back up," he said. The wedge did not back up. The point men hit him first, unarmed, which was the point. They weren't there to fight him. They were there to occupy him, to make his hands full of the wrong problem, while the weapon carriers tucked behind them found their angles. Danny went intangible as the first contact came, let the lead figure's momentum carry it through him, and off balance spun to catch the second with a telekinetic shove that sent it stumbling sideways into the third. The formation stuttered. Just for a second. The weapon carriers didn't wait. The angles they'd been calculating snapped open the moment Danny was visible, and 3 celestial edges came through the gap at once, not aimed at him, aimed past him at the door. He pulled the door shut with telekinesis from 6 feet back. The edges hit reinforced wood instead of the open frame, and the sound was a sharp crack followed by a groan of stressed material. The door held. For now. "Okay," Danny said to no one in particular. "New problem." Inside, Vaggie's voice cut through the lobby. "How long?" "Ask me in 30 seconds." He fired a ghost ray into the base of the wedge, not at anyone's center of mass, into the ground. Between their feet, the burst of ecto-energy throwing up debris and disrupting the synchronized footwork. The formation broke apart for 3 steps. That was all he needed. He was in the gap before they could close it, telekinesis pulling 2 weapon carriers' arms wide his own body, going intangible through the press of unarmed figures that tried to close around him. 2 short swords hit the ground. He sent them sideways into a storm drain without looking. But the moment he turned to track the next threat, the formation was already resealing. The point men had adjusted instead of rushing him. They were holding a tight perimeter around the weapon carriers, close enough that he couldn't reach through without occupying the same space as an unarmed figure, which created its own complications when the complication was accidentally phase someone into a wall. Danny pulled back to altitude. The wedge reassembled, resumed its advance. Thump, thump, thump. He hit it again from a different angle. Bought 10 seconds. They reformed. He hit it from above. Ghost ray into the leading edge disrupted the front rank, got the door another 30 seconds. They came back around. He stripped another celestial blade from the column's left flank, sent it to the roof with the others, turned to find the right flank had already filled the vacancy with a fresh arrival. That was when it clicked. He could stop a sword. He couldn't stop an assembly line. The rift above was still cycling. For every figure he removed from the equation, the gap lasted exactly as long as it took for the next one to come through and orient. The arithmetic wasn't close. He was burning effort against an operation that had infinite resupply and a very specific, very patient objective. Danny landed on the entrance arch and looked at the rift, then at the street, then at the door, which had taken 3 more impacts in the time he'd been doing the math. Inside the lobby, the hotel was holding its shape through pure stubbornness. Vaggie was at the interior side of the door, shoulder braced against the frame, calling positions to Husk and the 2 residents who had been pressed into something resembling a defensive line. Charlie had her shield up on the left flank of the entrance hall, blocking the gap where the east window had been, her jaws set in the expression of someone who was not going to say the thing they were thinking. Alastor stood at the foot of the main staircase and watched all of it with the patient interest of a man at the theater, waiting for the second act. Then he tilted his head the way a radio antenna tilts toward a signal, and shadow spilled from the base of his staff across the lobby floor. Not creeping, erupting dark tendrils spreading up the walls and across the ceiling until the lobby felt like the inside of something alive. They hit the door frame from the interior side, reinforcing it, wrapping the weak points in something that wasn't wood and wasn't stone, but held the way neither of those would have. The next impact from outside hit the door and went nowhere. "There," Alastor said pleasantly. "A little sturdier, for now." He adjusted his grip on the staff. "I do so hate an anticlimactic interval." Husk, from behind the bar, where he'd upended it as a secondary barrier, said nothing. He was pulling Sinners behind the bar with one arm and keeping his other wing flat against the wall. And the expression on his face communicated that he had developed a number of opinions about the current situation and was choosing not to express any of them. Nifty appeared briefly at the top of the staircase with a mop, assessed the lobby, and went back the way she'd come. Nobody asked. Danny came back through the broken east window and landed in the middle of the room. "The door's going to hold another few minutes," he said. "But that's not the problem." "Then what is?" Charlie asked. "The problem is the door is not the problem." He looked at her directly. "They have a working pipeline. Every time I clear something out front, something new comes through the rift and fills the space. I could do this for the next 6 hours, and the number of people out there would be exactly the same." Charlie's grip on her shield tightened. "So what do you need to do?" "I need to get to the source." He looked up through the ruined atrium ceiling to where the heavenly tier still pulsed in steady intervals above them. Not the troops. The opening. Vaggie turned from the door. "If you're gone, we lose the exterior. You lose it anyway, the moment they change approach again." He kept his voice level because this wasn't an argument. It was a problem with a shape, and the shape had one answer. The only way to buy real time is to make the rift stutter. Break the resupply rhythm. Even 60 seconds without fresh arrivals changes what's happening out there. Vaggie looked at Charlie. Charlie looked at the ceiling. The ceiling offered nothing useful. Outside, something heavy hit the reinforced door, heavier than a celestial short sword. The kind of impact that came from something with real mass behind it. The shadow webbing Alastor had threaded into the frame absorbed most of it. But the groan in the wood beneath was different this time. Lower. More final. "That," Danny said, "is their second option." They stopped pushing with the wedge. "And started pushing with something bigger," Vaggie finished. He nodded. "I need 60 seconds to get to altitude." Vaggie looked at the door, at the shadow webbing, at Alastor, who had not moved from the staircase foot and showed no intention of doing so. "We can give you 45 dinner," she said. "That works." He was already moving toward the atrium gap when Charlie said his name. He stopped. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was looking at him the way she'd been looking at him since the street, like she was still catching up to what he was. This kid who had dropped through a tear in the sky and immediately started pulling people out of the way of things that would end them. "The people you saved out there," she said. "They're inside. They're okay." A beat. "I just wanted you to know that." Danny processed this. It was a strange thing to say in the middle of a crisis, and also it was exactly the right thing. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He went up through the atrium gap and into the smoke above the hotel, and below him, the door took another impact, and the shadow webbing held, and Vaggie started counting. High above the building's roofline, the heavenly rift pulsed its cold and steady rhythm. White light cycling through in measured beats, each pulse dropping another cluster of white armor into the city below. Patient. Precise. The kind of operation that had been running without interruption for longer than the hotel had existed, longer than Charlie's project had existed, longer than anyone down here had seriously believed it could be stopped. Danny hung in the air 20 feet below the rift's lower edge and felt the wrongness radiating off it, not the wrongness of the celestial steel, which was a hard limit, a closed door. This was different. This was the wrongness of a machine that had never been asked to stop. He looked at the pulsing edge of it, at the rhythm, at the gaps between pulses where the cascade of descending figures briefly thinned. Not the troops, he'd said. The opening. He reached out. The thing about the tear in the sky was that it breathed. Not literally, Danny had been close enough to a lot of dimensional openings to know the difference between atmospheric pressure and actual respiration. But it had a rhythm. A pulse. Every 4 seconds, give or take, the edges of it would contract slightly and then expand, and in that expansion, a new cluster of white armor would drop through and begin its descent. Contraction, expansion, drop. Contraction, expansion, drop. Patient as a heartbeat. Precise as a machine. He hung 20 feet below the lower edge and read it for 6 seconds, which was long enough to know it wasn't a door. It was a conveyor belt, which meant the approach wasn't to slam it. The approach was to jam the gears. He reached out with ecto-energy, not a blast, not a ray, just a current, the kind of sustained output he used when he needed to feel the edges of a ghost zone portal before stepping through it. The energy moved ahead of him, like a hand testing water temperature, and when it touched the outer membrane of the tear, it came back with information frequency layering, the particular resonance of something that had been held open by an external source for a very long time. He could work with that. Below him, faint through the distance and the ambient noise of the street, he heard Vaggie counting. She was at 30. Which meant he had 15 seconds before she needed him back at the entrance, and 15 seconds was either enough or it wasn't. He pressed the ecto current harder against the membrane and started looking for the beat. The first attempt didn't take. He pushed energy into the rhythm instead of against it. The instinct when you wanted to interfere with a frequency was to push against it, but that was wrong. That just got absorbed. What worked was hitting slightly off phase, finding the half beat, where the membrane was contracting and adding just enough ectomass to make the contraction hesitate. He'd done something similar once with a Fenton portal, when the controls were fried and the thing was cycling too fast. You didn't fight the mechanism. You introduced a variable it hadn't been built to account for. The tear flickered. One pulse skipped. One cluster of descending white armor vanished. Not destroyed, just not delivered the gap in the conveyor, leaving a 2-second window where nothing came through. Below him across the street, Danny heard the sound of coordinated movement falter. just slightly, just enough to matter. He pressed the interference point wider. The second skip was longer, 4 seconds, maybe 5. The tier's edges pulled in a direction they hadn't been pulling before, the light cycling through it, going amber at the margins, which he was pretty sure meant stress. He could feel it in the current he was running through the membrane resistance, like a gear trying to find a tooth that wasn't where it expected. Vaggie was at 42. He had 3 seconds. The heavy impact hit the hotel entrance from below, the something bigger they'd switched to after the wedge, and even from this altitude, Danny felt it in his back teeth. The shadow-webbing Alastor had threaded into the frame was holding, but the sound it made was different now. The sound of something choosing how much longer to hold on. He made the decision the way he usually made decisions, under pressure, fast, with incomplete information, and with the full knowledge that hesitation was its own choice. He took a breath. He pulled the ecto current back into himself, compressing it, and then he didn't release it as a ray or a shield or a push. He opened his mouth and let it out as something else entirely. The ghostly wail wasn't loud the way an explosion was loud. It was loud the way our frequency was loud. It occupied space rather than passing through it, a sustained resonant discharge that his ghost half had only figured out how to produce in the worst stretch of his worst year, in which he still rationed carefully because the first time he'd used it, he'd leveled 6 city blocks and then passed out for 12 hours. He'd learned since then. He'd learned to shape it. He shaped it upward. Not a sphere, not a scatterblast, a focused cone aimed at the exact interference point he'd been building in the tear's membrane. The whale hit the stressed margin, and the result was immediate and specific. The tear convulsed. Not widened, not collapsed. Convulsed the edges, pulling inward and outward in rapid alternation, like something flinching, the steady 4-second pulse shredding into arrhythmia, and the light cycling through it, stuttering between white and a deep angry amber. 3 clusters of descending armor lost their bearing mid-fall. 2 corrected. 1 did not, its members scattering across the hotel's rooftop instead of the street, which was a new problem, but a smaller one than the alternative. Danny stopped the wail after 4 seconds. Not because he'd run out of it, because he could feel what happened when a dimensional membrane got pushed past a certain threshold. He'd felt it once before in a ghost zone accident that had taken his parents 2 months to patch. And the tear above him was starting to give in a direction that wasn't controlled. If he kept going, the stress fractures wouldn't produce a stutter. They'd produce a rupture. A bigger opening. Worse. So he stopped. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing he'd heard all night. Below, across the demolished street, everything paused. The remaining white armor on the ground had stopped advancing. Sinners who'd been running had stopped running. Inside the hotel, through the ruined atrium ceiling, Danny could see the lobby in fragments, Husk standing upright behind the bar. For the first time all night, Nifty frozen mid-motion with a knife in each hand. Charlie with her shield still raised, but her eyes turned upward, and Vaggie at the entrance, her count abandoned, looking at the sky with an expression that had nothing in it except calculation. The tear pulsed once, twice, slowly finding its rhythm again, but the rhythm was wrong now. Offbeat. The 4-second interval had stretched to 9, then 6, then 8. The resupply cascade was broken, not permanently, not completely, but enough. The cluster of armor that had been building at the rift's lower edge to fill the gap Danny had been working on had scattered, and it would take time to regroup. 60 seconds, maybe 90. Danny descended toward the rooftop with his ears ringing and the specific post-whale ache behind his eyes that always told him he'd pushed into the territory where restraint was the only thing keeping the aftermath manageable. He landed on the roof's edge and looked at the 3 exorcists who'd come down crooked. They were upright, but disoriented the off-target drop, having scrambled whatever internal navigation they used. They weren't advancing. they were reassessing. He filed that as not his problem right now and looked at the tear. It was still open, still cycling even with a broken beat. And at the center of it, barely visible at this distance, the amber stress light was fading back to white. The membrane pulling itself back toward its baseline parameters with the stubborn self-repair of something that had been doing this long enough to know how. He'd bought time. He hadn't won anything. From somewhere above the rift, well above it, a voice drifted down, not shouting, not alarmed, carrying the specific tone of someone who had just been presented with new information and was already converting it into strategy. "Well," Adam said, "isn't that something?" A pause. Then, in a different register, Crisper aimed downward at the soldiers on the ground. "Change of objective. We're done with the door." "Yeah." Another pause, and the easy amusement in his voice contracted into something with an edge. "Take the building." Below, Danny heard the sound of coordinated movement reforming. Not toward the entrance. Spreading outward, flanking the white armor, repositioning around the hotel's perimeter, with the mechanical patience of a siege that had just been told to stop being elegant and start being thorough. Danny looked at the hotel beneath him, at the roof line, at the walls that had already taken significant structural damage from 2 chapters of sustained impact, and were not going to take much more before the question stopped being, "Can we hold?" and became, "Where do we go?" He pressed 2 fingers against his temple where the ringing was worst and told himself the headache was manageable. It was manageable. The problem was everything else. The 60 seconds felt like 6. Not because they went fast, they didn't. They stretched with the particular elasticity of time under pressure, and every second subdividing into smaller decisions. But because the list of things that needed to happen inside them was longer than 60 seconds, could honestly accommodate. Danny had learned to work inside that gap anyway. You made the math fit, or you didn't, and not fitting had consequences. He dropped from the roofline to the street in the window between 2 pulse cycles. The breach in the resupply cascade still holding the white armor on the ground, reconfiguring toward the building's flanks rather than its front. Adam's order had been clear enough. Stop pushing the entrance. Take the building apart instead. Danny landed in the street and immediately started moving people. Not heroically functionally the way you moved furniture when the house was on fire. A sinner crouched behind a collapsed wall section got a hand on the shoulder and a direction. 2 more who'd been frozen in the open during the whale's aftermath got pointed toward the hotel's side entrance. He didn't stop to check if they understood. The fact that they were moving was understanding enough. Vaggie was already working the same calculus from the interior side. The side entrance open, calling positions in the clipped shorthand she'd been using all night. Between them, they cleared the exposed stretch of street in 40 seconds. The last 10 of Danny's window went to getting back in the air. He pushed ecto energy toward the seam again. The interference point he'd established during the whale was still there, frayed at the edges, the cascade source trying to smooth it back into baseline. But the stress fracture hadn't sealed completely. He threaded current into it carefully, not the sustained push he'd used before something subtler. A finger in a gear, rather than a hand. The goal wasn't to recreate the whale's impact. The goal was to keep the fracture from healing. The cascade source resisted. It was built to resist whatever mechanism held it open on heaven's side, had been doing this long enough to have redundancies back up rhythms that kicked in when the primary beat went arrhythmic. He could feel them engaging, feel the seam trying to reestablish its 4-second interval, and he kept introducing the variable that prevented it from locking back in. Off-phase pressure. Subtle enough that it didn't trigger a full response, persistent enough that the interval couldn't stabilize. The result wasn't clean. It was messy and imprecise, and it looked from the outside like a light fixture, with a failing connection, the cascade source flickering clusters dropping through at irregular intervals. Sometimes 2 in quick succession, and then a gap of 8 or 9 seconds where nothing came through at all. Not shut. Misfiring. He couldn't shut it. He could make it misfire. His right hand had developed a tremor he was pretending wasn't there. The post-whale ache behind his eyes had graduated from manageable to present and accounted for, a steady pressure that didn't impair him yet, but was keeping careful track of its options. He noted both things, assigned them to the category of information rather than emergency, and kept the current running. Below the building shuddered. Not the entrance this time, the east wall, where something with real mass had connected at foundation level. Then the west wall, same impact, same depth. A coordinated strike meant to test structural limits rather than breach them. Testing first. Adam was thorough, whatever else he was. Inside the hotel, visible through the atrium gap in fragments, Alastor had moved from the staircase foot to the center of the lobby, and the shadow webbing he'd threaded through the building's framework had thickened considerably. It was working. It was also costing him something. The usual effortless quality of his presence had developed a faint strain at the edges, the kind you only noticed if you were looking for it. The staff in his hand was doing something it hadn't been doing an hour ago. The wood was dark with absorbed impact, taking in the building's stress, so the walls themselves didn't have to. Danny noticed because he'd been watching for exactly that, since the shadow webbing first went up. He filed it away. Charlie had gathered 8 sinners in the lobby's back corridor. People who couldn't fight, couldn't run far, needed a roof and a decision made for them. She was making it triage resource allocation, who went deeper into the building and who stayed close enough to move if the back corridor became untenable. She wasn't talking about hope or redemption or what the hotel was supposed to mean. She was counting heads and moving people and checking whether the back stairs were still structurally sound. Danny had to acknowledge better at this than he'd expected. Vaggie appeared in the atrium gap below him, one hand on the frame looking up. "The east side is thinning," she said. "Whatever you're doing to their resupply is pushing them toward the flanks to compensate." The concentration on the east approach dropped 30%. "It won't hold like this." He kept his focus split between the conversation and the interference point, the way you kept one eye on traffic when crossing a street with someone talking to you. "I'm not blocking it. I'm making it inconsistent. They'll find a workaround." "How long?" "Until Adam gets tired of the variable and decides to stop compensating for it." He glanced down at her. "Which, based on the east wall test a minute ago, I'd say he's close." Vaggie processed this with the expression of someone who had already run the number and gotten a result they didn't like. "Then we use what we have." "Yeah." She went back inside. Danny stayed where he was and kept his finger in the gear. The workaround when it came was faster than he'd estimated. It didn't come from the cascade source. It came from below, a sound like something large and coordinated drawing breath. And then Lute's voice carried up from the street level, crisp and directional, cutting through the general noise the way a frequency cut through static. 2-column breach. East and west simultaneously. On my mark. Danny looked down. The white armor that had been testing the foundation was now organized into 2 distinct columns, one on each flank. Weapon carriers at the front, rather than behind. No more wedge formation. No more patient advance. This was a different intention entirely. Not press and hold, shatter and enter. He had about 4 seconds to decide what to do with that information and where he needed to be. Below Husk had overturned the second half of the bar and was using it as a secondary barrier across the lobby's center, which meant he'd already done the same math Danny was doing. Nifty had appeared from somewhere, the ceiling. Possibly it was genuinely difficult to track her, and was watching the east wall with the bright attentiveness of someone who had identified her moment and was waiting for it very patiently. "This is so much more interesting than a regular Tuesday," she said to no one in particular. No one responded because there wasn't time to respond, because Lute said mark. and both columns moved. The east wall took the first impact, and the crack that ran from the impact point to the window frame above it was the kind of crack that had an opinion about structural load-bearing. The west wall took the second impact half a second later, and the lobby's lights, what was left of them, flickered and went to emergency amber. The shadow webbing in the walls tightened. Danny felt it even from above the hotel pulling itself together around Alastor's framework the way a body tensed against a hit. It absorbed. It held. But Alastor made a sound. Brief controlled the kind of sound you make when you've taken something into yourself that cost more than the expression on your face is willing to admit. And one of the shadow tendrils, threading the east wall, went dark and didn't come back. Danny dropped. Not to the street. Into the hotel through the atrium gap, landing in the lobby, with enough presence that the sound of his boots on the cracked floor registered as its own punctuation mark in the noise. Charlie looked at him. He looked at the east wall where the crack had widened, where the framing around the window gap was showing the particular geometry of something that would not survive a third impact at the same point. "They're going to come through the wall," he said. "Not the entrance, the wall." Charlie looked at the wall, at the sinners in the back corridor, at Vaggie, who had already calculated the same outcome and was repositioning to face it. "Then we hold the wall," Charlie said. It wasn't a speech. It was 4 words in a voice that had stopped asking whether holding was possible and started treating it as a given. Danny found somewhat to his surprise that this was exactly the right tone for the room. He turned back toward the east wall. Outside it, he could hear the columns drawing back for a third impact, and above the building, accessible through the atrium gap if he needed it, the cascade source was misfiring in irregular bursts. His interference point still active, still costing him something with each passing minute, still keeping the resupply broken enough to matter. He couldn't hold both indefinitely. He knew that. The question was which one mattered more in the next 30 seconds. The east wall groaned. He had his answer. The east side gave on the third strike. Not catastrophically, the frame held the ceiling held, but the gap where the window had been widened by 2 feet, and the crack that had been tracking upward from the impact point reached the ceiling joint and stopped there, which was the structural equivalent of a held breath. The hotel was making a decision about how much longer it wanted to stand. Through the gap came 3 of Lute's breach unit, moving low and fast, the kind of entry that had been practiced enough to be automatic. They fanned immediately, 1 toward the lobby center, 2 toward the back corridor where the sinners Charlie had triaged were sheltering. Vaggie was already moving to intercept. She took the center threat first, 1 spear coming up to catch a descending celestial blade at the fort and redirect it wide, the impact running up her arm in a way she didn't show on her face. The second strike came faster. Lute's soldier pressing the angle she'd opened, and she gave ground 1 step, 2 calculated retreat rather than loss before her throwing dagger found the gap in the armored figure's extended reach and bought her the half-second she needed to reset. Danny, watching from the atrium gap where he'd been tracking the breach, did not go down to that duel. He went to the 2 heading for the back corridor instead. He hit the first one from above, with enough telekinetic force to redirect its trajectory into the second. Not a collision, but a stumble, the kind of sudden weight shift that interrupted momentum without requiring him to engage directly. Both figures recovered. They were trained. They didn't go down from stumbles, but the 2 seconds of reorientation was enough for the sinners in the back corridor to move deeper into the building past the point the breach unit had been vectoring toward. He put himself between the corridor entrance and the 2 soldiers and held up his hands. "You can go around me," he said. "You'd have to catch me first, and I'd really rather you didn't. There are easier targets." He let a faint ecto-glow run along his knuckles. "For the record, I'm not one of them." They assessed. 1 moved to flank. He went intangible and let the flanking move pass through him, which produced a satisfying moment of confusion, then re-solidified between the flank and the corridor. The other came straight at him, and he sidestepped telekinesis, pulling its weapon arm wide. The celestial edge passing close enough that he felt the specific cold he'd felt before the one that wasn't temperature, and his focus sharpened to a single point. Not playing close with those, not with other people behind him. He fired a ghost ray into the floor between the two soldiers. The burst of ecto-energy not aimed at either of them, but between them, the concussive effect enough to break their coordinated advance and give him room to maneuver. One stumbled back toward the gap it had entered through. He encouraged it in that direction with another telekinetic shove and turned his attention to the second. Behind him in the lobby, the sound of Vaggie's fight had changed pitch. He didn't turn around. He trusted the sound, the pattern of it, the rhythm, the way you trusted peripheral information when your immediate problem hadn't resolved yet. The sound said Vaggie was moving well, pressing her own attack, which meant he didn't need to redirect his attention. He kept his eyes on the soldier in front of him, stripped its weapon with a clean telekinetic pull at the moment its grip loosened after a feint and sent it out through the gap in the east side. The soldier retreated. Danny turned around. Vaggie had driven the lobby's central threat into a corner near the reception desk, her two spears working in alternating rhythm. One pressing the defense, while the other reset a pattern that kept the armored figure reactive rather than aggressive. It was working. It was also working because the figure she was fighting wasn't Loot. Loot came through the east gap at that moment, and the difference was immediate and measurable in the way the room's pressure changed. She moved like a correction. Everything about her was precise. The angle of approach, the arc of the celestial blade she carried, the specific point on Vaggie's back she had already identified as her target before she'd fully cleared the entry. Danny saw it clock the angle and made a decision in the time it took Loot's first step to land. He reached out with telekinesis, not for Loot, not for her weapon, but for a section of ceiling debris that had been hanging loose since the second strike, and pulled it down between Loot's projected path and Vaggie's back. The debris fell across the approach in a cascade of plaster and broken lath, not a barrier, just an interruption enough to make Loot's precision strike land 2 feet left of where it had been going. Vaggie heard the debris fall and turned. She and Loot looked at each other across the lobby in the particular way of people who have been building toward this specific conversation for longer than tonight. "You should have stayed dead," Loot said. Her voice was the same temperature as the flat of her blade. "You should have checked better," Vaggie said. Danny took 3 steps back and kept his hands visible at his sides. If he stepped into that duel, he ended it. He could do that, pull Loot's weapon, put himself between them, use the power differential to make it not a fight anymore. But that wasn't what this needed. Vaggie knew what she was doing. She knew who she was fighting and why and what it meant, and taking that away from her, even with the right intentions, was a different kind of damage. He stayed back, watched the angles, and let it be hers. The duel that followed was not elegant. It was 2 people who understood celestial weapons and how to survive them, one of whom had been using one her entire adult life, and one of whom had learned to live without it. Loot pressed every advantage her prosthetic arm gave her, the reach, the structural reinforcement in the grip, the fact that one side of her attack couldn't be tired out. Vaggie matched it with adaptability, reading Loot's dominant angles and refusing to engage them directly, making the fight happen in the spaces Loot's precision hadn't accounted for. The lobby shuddered. Another strike on the west face, Adam's flanking pressure maintaining itself, even while the breach had already succeeded, and a section of the upper mezzanine railing came down in a slow avalanche of iron and plaster dust. Alastor's shadow webbing caught most of it. Most of it. The tendrils that laced the western load-bearing partition had thinned to something approaching translucency, and the radio demon himself was no longer at the center of the lobby. He'd moved or been moved. It was difficult to tell, to the foot of the staircase, one hand flat against the newel post, the other on his staff. His smile was present, but it had stopped reaching his eyes, which was either because the strain of maintaining the framework was pulling his attention inward, or because something about the night had stopped being sufficiently entertaining. The staff had gone very dark. The wood was absorbing more than it was designed for, and it knew it. "Splendid effort," he said to no one in particular, in the tone of a man reminding himself of something. Husk, from somewhere behind the overturned bar, said, "You good?" A pause. "Perfectly. Right." Neither of them sounded like they believed it. Danny tracked all of this in the margins of his attention, while keeping his primary focus on Vaggie and loot and the geometric problem of where not to be when the next swing happened. He twice redirected falling debris that would have disrupted Vaggie's footing. Once he stepped into the path of a second soldier who had made it through the west entry and pointed at the floor with a ghost ray burst that made very clear there were better uses of that soldier's time. The soldier found another direction. He did not touch loot. He did not get between Vaggie and loot. He removed every other variable from Vaggie's equation and left her the one variable that mattered. The west entry blew open, not a breach unit entry. Something larger, something that came with its own light source, the kind of clean, cold radiance that Danny had been reading as bad news since the first pulse of the night. Adam came through the west wall like the wall had always been a suggestion, his wingspan clearing the frame with casual contempt, and the lobby of the Hazbin hotel rearranged itself around the new gravitational fact of his presence. He looked at the room, at Alastor diminished at the staircase foot, at Vaggie and loot mid-duel, at the sinners huddled in whatever shelter remained, at Danny. He lingered on Danny for exactly 2 seconds longer than he lingered on anything else. "Huh," he said. "Still here?" Then he looked past Danny at the back corridor, at the people in it, at the hotel itself, at the whole stubborn, broken, refusing to quit fact of the place, and the easy amusement in his expression contracted into something colder and more purposeful. He raised one hand. The light that came from it hit Alastor's shadow framework like a frequency hits a structure at its resonant point. Not a brute force impact, but a targeted dissolution, the shadows pulling apart at their connection nodes, tendrils going dark in sequence from the outer edges inward. Alastor made a sound that his face immediately denied making, and the last of the Western Partition's reinforcement came undone. The wall didn't fall, but it moved and it groaned, and the crack that appeared in the ceiling above it was a very specific kind of crack. In the back corridor, Charlie heard it. She'd been steady until then, counting heads, making calls, doing the work of keeping people alive in a building that was progressively renegotiating its structural commitments. She'd been the thing the room needed her to be, which was practical and present, and not the girl watching her project disintegrate around her. But she heard the crack, and she heard through the ruin of the west entry the silence that followed Adam's strike, the silence of a building deciding, and something in her chest made a decision that her face hadn't caught up to yet. She looked at the people in the corridor, at the hotel around them, at the specific kind of damage being done not just to walls and frames, but to the things she'd built this to mean. "Get to the stairs," she said. Her voice had dropped a register. "All of you, now." They went, because that voice left no room for anything except compliance. She walked out of the corridor and into the lobby, and the pitchfork was in her hand before she'd consciously decided to conjure it, and the light that came off her was the particular shade of furious that didn't have a name in the color spectrum, because it wasn't a color, it was a temperature. Adam looked at her the way you look at something that has just become more interesting. "There she is," he said. Charlie looked at him. At the lobby. At what was left of the place she had built from nothing, on the premise that something different was possible. "Get away from my people, Wishnan," she said. She hit him like weather. The loft railing went. 2 load-bearing considerations went with it. Debris that had been clinging to the ceiling let go all at once and came down in a roar and through the dust and the light and the sound of something very large happening in a very small space. Danny could see the two of them, Charlie burning Adam laughing, the lobby becoming the stage for something that had been building since before tonight. He could not help her with this. This was not the kind of fight that had room for a third participant. What he did was make sure everyone who wasn't Charlie or Adam was not in the lobby when the next exchange happened. He moved through the dust with his hands on shoulders and collars and elbows, pointing directions, pulling people toward the staircase, going intangible when the ambient energy in the room got close enough to register as a threat. Vaggie appeared at his side, one arm pressed close to her side in the way of someone who had taken a hit they weren't advertising. Loot was not with her. Danny didn't ask where Loot was. He pointed at the staircase. "Go," he said. "Charlie, I know. Go." She went. He stayed until the lobby was empty of everyone except the two figures at its center. And then he took the staircase himself, and the sound of the hotel's oldest argument continued below him, shaking the walls with something that had never been about the building at all. Lucifer Morningstar did not announce himself. There was no dramatic entrance, no monologue, no build-up that gave anyone time to prepare. One moment the upper staircase landing was empty, and the next it wasn't. And the man standing there looked like he'd stepped out of a very long and very boring meeting to deal with something he'd hoped wouldn't require his personal attention. White suit, neat. The kind of neat that cost effort to maintain and hadn't cost him any tonight, which said something. He looked at what was left of the ground floor. At Adam, who had Charlie cornered against the shattered reception desk. At the dust still settling from the western partition. At Alastor at the foot of the staircase. Staff dark posture maintained through what was visibly an act of will rather than comfort. Then he looked at Adam. "You redecorated?" Lucifer said pleasantly. "I hate it." Adam turned. The expression on his face behind the mask cycled through several things in quick succession. Surprise, recalculation, something that was almost satisfaction. Well, look who finally showed up. I was busy. Lucifer came down the stairs at a pace that suggested he had all the time in existence and had chosen to spend this particular portion of it here. You know how it is. Paperwork. He stepped off the last stair and the temperature in the ground floor changed. Not literally. Hell didn't work in temperature, not exactly, but the pressure did the sense of weight in the air the way every person still conscious in the building without exception became aware of exactly where Lucifer was standing and exactly how far away from him they were. Adam raised a hand. Lucifer was already moving. Danny halfway across what remained of the main hall with a sinner over one shoulder and two more behind him, caught the exchange in his peripheral vision and made an immediate decision. Do not stop moving. If he went after Adam now, and he could, he'd been tracking the fight's geometry all night. He knew exactly how to insert himself. People died behind him. The sinner he was carrying had taken a debris hit to the ribs and couldn't walk unassisted. The two behind him were both conscious and upright, primarily because they had nowhere else to direct their attention. If he put them down to go chase the boss fight, they stopped being his problem in the kind of way that couldn't be fixed later. He got them to the stairwell, handed off to a resident who'd been using the upper landing as a relay point, and went back for more. The main hall had become two separate realities running in parallel. In one, Lucifer and Adam were doing what ancient powerful things did when they finally stopped pretending to tolerate each other fast. Precise, the collateral expressed in structural damage rather than the prolonged exchanges Danny was used to from ghost zone conflicts. In the other, the building was settling into its new understanding of its own limits, which was to say it was coming apart methodically in the way a structure comes apart when it's been asked to hold too much for too long. Danny worked the second reality and stayed out of the first. Telekinesis caught a load-bearing section of ceiling that decided to separate from its supports above the back hall. He held it for 8 seconds, long enough for 3 people to clear the space beneath it, then guided it down at an angle that kept the debris away from anyone still moving. His arms weren't in it. The effort was entirely ecto, the kind of sustained output that would have been impossible 6 months ago and was now merely expensive. He was going to feel this tomorrow. Across the hall, Vaggie had found a secondary position near the collapsed east entry, her 2 spears held low. Loot was still in the building. She was methodical about that. Hadn't broken off, hadn't retreated, was working a patient approach that Danny respected, even while he was actively hoping Vaggie had an answer to it. Vaggie did. She'd been letting Loot press the initiative for the last 3 exchanges, reading the prosthetic arm's range and timing, building a picture of the gaps. On the 4th exchange, she didn't yield ground. She stepped into the swing instead of back from it, closer than the prosthetic arm was built to work. And her elbow found Loot's extended wrist at the joint between the mechanical and the biological in a way that made Loot's grip falter for the half-second Vaggie needed. The spear in her right hand came up. Loot caught it. Barely. The impact of the block drove her back a full step, which for Loot was the equivalent of being knocked across a room, and in the moment of recovery, her head turned involuntary. Trained reflex toward the source of the pressure wave that had just swept through the main hall from the Lucifer atom exchange. A pillar of the old ballroom ceiling, softened by the sustained structural insults of the last hour, chose that moment to make its final decision. It came down between Vaggie and Loot in a cascade of plaster and ancient iron fittings, and when the dust settled, the geometry of the engagement had been rearranged. Loot looked at the fallen section, at Vaggie on the other side of it, at the main hall where the exchange between her commanding officer and the King of Hell was progressing in ways that clearly required her assessment. She made the decision quickly. She was many things, and impractical wasn't one of them. "Next time," she said across the debris. She went for the closest exit. Danny, who had been positioning to make sure that exit remained available, precisely because he'd seen Loot running this calculation, stayed out of her path. Letting her leave was the right call. Stopping her would have been a distraction from 4 other things that needed his attention more. Husk's voice came from somewhere above and to the left, which meant he'd made it to the mezzanine level at some point. "Oh good, the ceiling's going. Wonderful. Really topping off the evening." Danny looked up. Husk was correct. The mezzanine structure, which had been valiantly pretending it wasn't compromised for the last 20 minutes, was now in open negotiation with gravity about its immediate future. The ironwork railing had half separated from its mounts. The floor of it was showing the particular sag that meant the joists beneath had made their peace. He got to it in 4 seconds and put everything he had into a telekinetic brace from below. Not enough to hold it indefinitely enough to slow the collapse from sudden to staged. Husk, reading the situation correctly, used the extra seconds to get to the main staircase and get off the structure. The mezzanine came down in sections rather than all at once, which was the difference between a problem and a catastrophe. In the main hall, Adam was no longer laughing. Lucifer had a way of making things unfunny very quickly. Not through any particular savagery, but through the simple application of a capability gap that Adam, for all his bluster, could not argue with by force of personality alone. The fight had been short by the standards of anything that mattered, and Adam had known it was short, and he'd spent the last 90 seconds doing the thing that people did when they knew they were losing, making sure the loss cost something. He hit the building, not a person, not a specific structural target. Just the building, an open-handed strike of concentrated angelic force into the nearest load-bearing element, and the intent was clear: if he couldn't keep the hotel, he could make sure it couldn't keep itself. The north wall cracked through from foundation to roofline. Danny heard the sound and understood it immediately. He was already moving toward the back corridor where Charlie had sent the sinners, where the staircase access was, where the highest concentration of people who couldn't protect themselves from falling architecture were waiting before the second sound came, which was the north wall, deciding the crack was a good start and expanding on it. He caught the ceiling. Again, different section, different weight, different angle. Same fundamental problem of too much mass, moving too fast in a direction no one wanted. He held it. His ears were ringing. His focus had narrowed to the physical geometry of the load above him, and the question of whether anyone was still underneath it. And the answer was yes. 2 people, and they scrambled clear in the 3 seconds he bought them. And then he let it go, because holding it longer than necessary was exactly the kind of heroic inefficiency that got people killed. The building groaned from its foundations up. In the main hall, Adam was on the ground. Danny didn't see exactly how it happened. He'd been looking at the ceiling, but Nifty was standing approximately where Adam had been standing. And the expression on her face was the specific expression of someone who had done something they'd been waiting to do for the entire evening and found it entirely satisfying. She had a knife. The knife had done its job. The mechanics of the situation were clear enough that Danny didn't need the details. Nifty turned, looked at Danny and said, "Very messy. I'm going to need a better mop." Then she left to find one. Apparently, the remaining exorcists on the exterior, without their commanding voice, without the operational structure Adam had been providing, shifted into the hesitation pattern that Danny recognized from ghost zone altercations when the ghost controlling the smaller ghosts went down. Not retreat, not yet. Assessment. Recalculation. Loot was outside somewhere, and Loot was not the kind of person who let a moment of recalculation go to waste. But the window between the command structure collapsing and her being able to rebuild it was a window, and Danny intended to use it. He went back out through the compromised north entry into what had been the street, and was now a field of mixed debris and scattered armor, and he started moving people again. Sinners who'd gone to ground during the final exchange. Souls who'd been sheltering in adjacent structures. The ones who couldn't move themselves and had been waiting for someone to notice. He noticed. Charlie found him there 20 minutes later in the relative quiet that followed. She was carrying Vaggie's weight on one side. Vaggie managing her own footing, but accepting the support with the particular grace of someone who'd decided that tonight was not the night to make a point about independence. Lucifer was a few steps behind them, his white suit having lost the argument with the evening in several places, looking at the state of the street with the expression of a man revising an estimate. The hotel stood, partially. The north and west faces had significant structural failures. The mezzanine was gone. The ground floor was a map of everything that had happened to it, but it stood. Danny was sitting on a piece of former exterior wall with his elbows on his knees, doing the specific kind of nothing that came after a long period of doing too much. He looked at the building, at the people coming out of it, and the people he'd been pulling in off the street for the last 20 minutes. At Charlie, who was looking at the same building with an expression he couldn't fully read, but recognized in its general shape. "How many?" she asked. He'd been keeping count. Everyone who could be moved got moved. Some of them are in rough shape. He paused. The building got the rest of it. She nodded. There wasn't anything to say to that which would have improved on the silence, so she didn't say anything. From somewhere in the debris field to the north, a screen flickered. Just briefly. A small display unit that had somehow survived the structural event, still connected to whatever signal it had been receiving before everything fell. Showing a frame of static, and then for 3 seconds before it died, a logo. Vox Media. The caption beneath it was only partially visible through the cracked display. Unidentified entity interferes with Heaven's operation. Then the screen went dark. Danny stared at the dead screen for a moment, then at Lucifer, who had seen it too, and was wearing the expression of someone who had just identified the next problem before the current one had finished settling. "That's going to be a complication," Lucifer said. "Yeah, Danny said. "It usually is." The dust was still coming down slow and fine, settling over the street and the ruin of the hotel and the people sitting in it. Somewhere inside the building, Husk was audibly explaining his feelings about the situation to anyone who would listen and several people who had stopped. Nifty had found a broom. The exorcists were gone. The rift above had closed, not because anyone had shut it, but because the operation it had been serving no longer had a command structure to report to, and Heaven's machinery, whatever else it was, ran on logistics. It had been a night. Danny looked at the rubble. Where the north wall had been, at the Sinners, scattered across the street, in the particular arrangement of people who had survived something and hadn't yet been told what to do with that. And then he looked up at the sky over Pentagram City. Clear now, or as clear as hell's sky ever got. The tear completely gone, the cold white light that had been pulsing down all night finally absent. He'd bought time. He'd kept people alive. He hadn't fixed anything. He was pretty sure that was the most anyone could have done tonight. And he was equally sure that it wasn't going to be enough for what came next. He'd think about what came next in a minute. Right now, he was sitting on a piece of wall in hell, and the building behind him was still standing, and that was going to have to be sufficient. The dust took a long time to settle. Not metaphorically, literally, the particulate from 2 collapsed sections of the hotel hanging in Pentagram City's air for the better part of an hour, catching the ambient red glow and turning it into something almost beautiful if you'd forgotten what it cost. Danny sat on the same piece of former exterior wall and watched it drift and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he'd developed specifically for the aftermath of bad nights. The work wasn't done yet. The work was never done in the immediate aftermath. There were people still unaccounted for in the northern section. A portion of the 3rd floor that hadn't come down, but had shifted in ways that made it structurally unreliable. And at least 2 sinners who'd gotten turned around in the confusion and ended up in an adjacent building that now had strangers in it, and no clear sense of whose jurisdiction that made it. He lifted a collapsed section of the northern face with a sustained telekinetic hold high enough for Vaggie and 2 residents to drag a man clear who'd been pinned since the final exchange. The load was about 400 pounds. He held it for 40 seconds. When he set it down, he flexed his right hand twice, noted the tremor had resolved overnight into a dull stiffness, and moved on to the next thing. This was what peak looked like in the hours after. Not dramatic, just continuous. Charlie found a rhythm somewhere in her 3rd hour of work. Not hope exactly, more like the practical cousin of hope. The version that involved making a list and working through it. She'd set up a triage area in the street, using sections of intact wall as windbreaks, and she moved between it and the ruin with the particular efficiency of someone who had stopped asking whether this was working and started asking what was next. She found Danny at the edge of the northern section, cross-referencing the sound of the remaining structure, with what he could feel through the telekinetic field he'd spread across the foundations. 2 people in the back of the 2nd floor, he said before she asked. They're okay. The access route is blocked but not collapsed. I can get to them. How? He went intangible by way of answer, demonstrating, then came back solid. Through. I'll bring them out the same way. She watched him go. When he came back with the 2 sinners one at a time, gently, the intangibility working around them. Rather than through them, she was still standing there, and the expression on her face was the one he'd been seeing. Increments of, all night, the expression of someone whose idea was working in ways she hadn't fully prepared herself for. You could have gone home, she said. I could have. He agreed. She waited for more. He didn't offer any because the explanation was simple enough that saying it would have made it smaller. He'd looked at the street. He'd done the count. The math said he was needed here, and that was the beginning and end of it. Inside what remained of the ground floor, Husk had righted the bar. The actual bar counter, the physical object through some feat of leverage and stubbornness, and was serving drinks to anyone who came in from the rubble with the right combination of shell-shocked and upright. He'd made no announcement about it. He'd just done it, and people had started showing up, which seemed to be how Husk operated when he was being his better self rather than his default self. Nifty had produced a broom. She was working the northern section in the systematic pattern of someone who had a very clear idea of what clean looked like and a very high tolerance for scale. 47? She said, as Danny passed her with a load-bearing fragment he was relocating to a spot less likely to fall on anyone. 47 what? Dust piles. I've made 47. I'm going for 60. He didn't ask. Some things were better as facts than as explanations. Alastor was at a table that hadn't been there before he'd found it somewhere, set it in the middle of the functional portion of the ground floor, and was sitting at it with a cup of something and his restored staff across his knees. The staff had been repaired. Not perfectly, there was a grain in the wood at its midsection that hadn't been there before, a place where the material had taken more than it was meant to and been persuaded to hold anyway. He noticed Danny noticing this and smiled with the warmth of a door with a lock on the wrong side. An eventful evening, Alastor said. Yeah. You held the resupply line for 43 minutes. He set down his cup. I kept count. Danny considered this. Why? Because interesting things are worth counting. The smile didn't change. You're very interesting, Danny, for a child. I'm 14. Yes. He picked up his cup again. Terrifying, isn't it? Wasn't a question. Danny let it not be one and moved on. The signal came from a screen that shouldn't have been on. It was one of the secondary broadcast units that peppered Pentagram City's infrastructure small enough to survive on backup power when the primary grid went unreliable. It flickered to life on the face of the building across the street while Danny was moving a section of collapsed northern wall into a stable configuration, and because it was directly in his line of sight, he had no choice but to read it. The visual was shaky, pulled from a distance through dust and intermittent obstruction, but the resolution was good enough. It showed the exterior of the hotel during the ghostly whale's aftermath. The rift above stuttering clusters of white armor losing their bearing mid-descent. It showed Danny, from 3 separate angles, which meant Vox had had cameras deployed in this neighborhood before the extermination started, which was its own category of unsettling. The chyron beneath it read, Unidentified entity disrupts heaven's operation. What is the ghost boy of hell? Then, underneath that, in a font designed to look urgent, rather than be urgent, exclusive, who controls him? Danny stared at the screen for 4 seconds. Then he went invisible, a pure reflex. The kind that happened before conscious thought caught up, and then caught himself and came back. Because going invisible in a street full of people who knew he was there was a different problem than it solved. He went and found Charlie. She was already watching a different screen. Vox had multiple units, it turned out, and they were all running variations of the same story. She had her arms crossed and her jaws set in the expression of someone processing a very fast succession of things they didn't like. Who controls him? She read aloud. That's the frame they're using. I noticed. They're going to make you a weapon or a monster, whichever gets more engagement. She turned to look at him directly, and the practicality that had been carrying her through the work hours gave way briefly to something more direct. He's 14, she said to the general principle of the situation, rather than anyone in particular. He came here by accident and spent the night keeping people alive. That's the story. That's not the story Vox wants, Vaggie said from the doorway. She'd come out while they were talking, her arm still pressed close to her side in the field expedient management of a hit she wasn't advertising. He's going to run with whatever version makes the other overlords nervous or curious enough to tune in. And right now, Both options involve Danny. Danny looked at the screen. At the three angles of himself mid-wail, the image frozen. On the worst possible frame, ecto energy at full output, eyes lit the rift convulsing behind him. He understood in the particular way that 14 years of existing as something nobody had a category for had taught him exactly what was happening. "I've done this before," he said. "Different city, same problem." He looked at Charlie. "The part where everyone argues about what I am while I'm standing right there." Charlie held his gaze. "What do you want to do about it?" It was a better question than most people asked. He thought about it honestly, rather than performing thought about it. "I want to go home," he said. "Eventually. I don't have a way to right now. The tear that dropped me here closed with the rest of them, and I'd need either equipment or a ghost zone access point to reconstruct the crossing." He paused. "But I can't leave with Vox running that story. Not because I care about my reputation in hell, which is a sentence I didn't expect to say tonight. Because if he establishes the narrative now, anything Charlie's trying to do with this place gets eaten by it." Vaggie looked at Charlie. Charlie looked at Danny with the expression of someone recalibrating. "So you're staying," Vaggie said. "For now. Until there's something in place that doesn't collapse the moment I go through a portal." He shrugged the small economical shrug of someone who'd already done the math on this and found it straightforward. "I'm not here to be anyone's weapon. I'm not here to run hell. I'm here because I was needed here, and I'm still needed here, and when I'm not, I'll go home." A long pause settled over the three of them, comfortable enough. Lucifer materialized at the edge of their circle with the quiet of someone who'd been present for a while without the inconvenience of being noticed. He looked at Danny with the particular attention of a man who had been alive long enough to find almost nothing interesting, and had just found something interesting. "The rift intervention," he said. "The phase lock technique. Where did you learn dimensional interference?" "I didn't. I worked it out." Another pause. Lucifer's expression shifted through something that might in different lighting have been respect. 14, Charlie said firmly, in case that had been lost. "I'm aware," Lucifer said. "I'm choosing to find it alarming rather than threatening. It's more productive." He turned to the street, to the rubble and the triage, and the work still continuing in the amber dark. "The extermination schedule is going to be reviewed. What happened tonight, what he did to the resupply mechanism, heaven can't ignore that. There'll be consequences." He looked at Danny again. "Some of them will probably involve people looking for you specifically." "Yeah," Danny said. "Welcome to my life." Lucifer almost smiled. Almost. The screen across the street had cycled to a new segment, a different angle, this one from higher up, showing the moment the whale hit the tear's membrane. And the white light went arrhythmic. Someone had scored it with dramatic audio. Below the image, the ghost boy of hell, friend or threat. Husk appeared at Danny's elbow as if summoned by the specific frequency of a terrible news cycle. "You want a drink?" "I'm 14. "I know. I was being polite." He looked at the screen. "That's gonna follow you around?" "Probably." "Hell's like that." He looked at the rubble at the triage area at Nifty, approaching what he assumed was dust pile 48 with the focus of a professional. "Hotel's gonna take a while to fix." "Yeah." "You're gonna be here for it, aren't you?" Danny looked at the ruin of the Hazbin hotel. The north face open to the sky, the mezzanine absent the ground floor, a record of everything that had tried to bring it down, and at the people coming out of it, and the people working on it, and the dim but persistent fact that it was still by any reasonable definition standing. "For a while," he said. Husk grunted. It was the kind of grunt that meant several things simultaneously and chose not to specify which. High above the city, in the direction that wasn't quite up and wasn't quite elsewhere, something flickered. Not the tear that had sealed with the operation's collapse and shown no sign of reopening. Something smaller. A resonance in the dimensional fabric at the city's northern edge, faint enough that Danny almost missed it, present enough that he caught it on the second pass of his awareness. Not a threat. Not yet. Just a signal that the membrane between here and somewhere else had been stressed enough tonight to leave a record, and records had a way of attracting attention. He filed it in the category he'd been building, all-night information, rather than emergency. Then, somewhere in the wreckage of the hotel's northern section, in the specific kind of silence that followed a very long and very loud night, a screen came on a small personal unit that one of the sinners had been carrying and had somehow survived the structural collapse, intact. The signal it was receiving wasn't from Vox's network. It was something else. Something that had no business being visible from hell. It showed a gate, white and clean and very bright. The kind of brightness that was architectural rather than aggressive. And standing in front of it, looking confused but remarkably intact, was a tall figure in a snake motif flying contraption with a stunned expression and inexplicably a fresh halo. Sir Pentious, in heaven. The sinner holding the screen said nothing. Just turned it around slowly so the people nearest him could see. The small cluster of survivors looked at the image, at each other, at the image again. Charlie looked at it from across the rubble, and the practical cousin of hope that had been running her all night stopped being the practical cousin of anything and became the real thing, undisguised for about 4 seconds before she controlled her face again. Danny looked at it too. He thought about systems and what it meant when a system produced an outcome it wasn't designed for. He thought about what he'd said to Charlie. I came here because I was needed here. He thought about the screen across the street still running its story about the ghost boy of hell and who controlled him. He looked at Pentious in the gate's light and at Charlie's face and at the ruin of the building behind her, that a collection of people had spent a night dying for the right to keep standing. Huh, he said quietly. It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest, which in Danny's experience was the more useful of the two. The dust kept settling. The work continued. Somewhere across the city, in a tower that had survived the night without a scratch because it had not been anyone's target, a screen that was also a face lit up with interest, and Vox leaned forward in his chair, and the story he was building got a new thread added to it. The ghost boy of hell, the Chiron read, and no one controls him. That Vox understood was the most dangerous version of the story, and therefore the most valuable. He started building it.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.